Hey guys, in today's video I'm going to show you how to tune all-wheel drive cars, otherwise known as four-wheel drive cars if you're old enough like me to remember. I understand in Forza Horizon as well as Motorsport, these can be very difficult cars to tune for people, and there are a lot of mistakes that people make when it comes to building them, how they prioritise the grip or power, alongside some of the settings, especially differential. So with that said, I'm going to show you how to tune all-wheel drive cars in general using the Ford RS200 as an example. Reason being, this is one of my favourite cars in S-Class when all-wheel drive. It's actually a bit of a hidden lobby beast and you can actually do some really decent leaderboard times. So with that said, let me show you what it's capable of and then we'll tuck right into how to build the car and then how to tune it. So first looking up, we can see it's got a top 30 time around Kota West. So as you can imagine, it's quite a short track, one that has a lot of weaving bends, but to be honest, when it comes to all-wheel drive cars, the main strengths for them around corners where it's a lot of point and shoot, basically tight chicanes followed by short runways where the car's acceleration can run away faster out of the turns from front-wheel drive cars or rear-wheel drive cars. So as you can see, pretty good time. I think it can go a lot faster because I've actually matched that 133 flat in the night time. So I reckon this can do a 132 quite comfortably and be higher up the board. But that is just an example of it at S800. In terms of the build I actually made for this car, there's literally only a 10 horsepower difference between this and then a version that we have for the Rally Heroes division. So this is a homologation division, and we can see that at 797 PI, a bit of a weird number I know, but me and the other JSR guys, Ron Wide and James, we're obviously just trying to mess around with not going at S800. We can see we got third in the world for this division. The car does seem to be the best, but it's the Lancia Group B, funny enough, was the car historically that actually had the world record title. So we're able to show that the RS200 is definitely capable of good stuff. And as I mentioned, it's literally only a 10 horsepower difference I have between this one for the division to the build that I have for S-Class in general. Both of them tunes are available, so by all means download them and feel free to use them. But with that said, let's now tuck right into what you need to do if you want to build this car. Okay, so as we tuck right into the tunes and upgrades right away, I'll first walk you through the actual build that I had done, and I'm going to first go over to conversions, because conversions are very much going to determine what you're going with. Now, in a lot of cars, you'll notice that you have stock powertrain and then something else. For the division, we had to keep it a stock powertrain, but one thing I'd want to mention is sometimes you want to keep it stock, sometimes you want to change the engine. The main reason will be it's not just about the power but also the amount of torque, because the torque actually delivers a lot of that initial acceleration coming out of turns. So we noticed that on these there's a different line in terms of where the torque moves, but overall there's not much difference and we couldn't afford to change the engine anyway for this build. But most importantly, the drivetrain. Is it naturally an all-wheel drive car, or is it a rear-wheel drive car that you then need to swap to all-wheel drive? This will play a very big part in whether or not you want a car to be all-wheel drive. A lot of people make the mistake that they'll just turn any car into all-wheel drive and it will immediately be faster. Obviously this is the case in Forza Horizon 4, where all-wheel drive is pretty much the meta for multiplayer. You need all-wheel drive to take advantage of all the rough terrain, the grass, the mud and what have you. But in Forza Motorsport it's a lot different. There's only a handful of cars that really excel when it comes to being four-wheel drive. So feel free to experiment, but just bear that in mind. For the Ford RS200, along with the Nissan Skylines and the very famous Mitsubishi Lancer, their strengths are definitely as all-wheel drive cars, as is quite obvious. So we obviously have the drivetrain already there. In terms of the front bumper and rear spoiler, you typically do want to have race on both of them because you want to create as much downforce as possible, because when it comes to the tuning, we're actually going to try and make the car quite oversteery. We want there to be some twitchiness to it. but I will tuck into the reason of that later on. So with the tyres, for the division build, the best we can go with is sport tyre compound. You can obviously move it up higher, just for S-Class or any other class in general. What I would say is you definitely want to prioritise the handling and acceleration over any other stat. Forget about the speed, and to some extent don't worry about the braking so much, but you really need handling, because whenever you make that conversion to all-wheel drive, or you have all-wheel drive naturally, what you find is the case is the handling says the stats are a lot lower than what the car's actually capable of. It's just a weird gimmick in the Forza games, but basically when it comes to low speed corners, so think of tight chicanes and low speed bends where you can accelerate really early, just imagine that your handling actually has a few decimals higher. So in this case we have 6.1 handling, but around a track like Kota West it actually drives like it's got 6.5, 6.6. It's only on the fast bends that all-wheel drive cars really struggle, so bear that in mind. You don't always need maximum amount of handling, but in S-Class you definitely want at least 6.0, ideally 6.1 to 6.3. But in this case we would have sacrificed way too much power in order to do it, and we couldn't fit it into the divisions, so that is a key thing to bear in mind. Of course we have the maximum front tyre width, and the same can be said for the rear tyre width. Sometimes you won't want to have the maximum on the front, because sometimes it can actually create a bit too much scrub, where basically the tyres are all so wide and so fat that there's too much traction, and sometimes the car will end up understeering a bit more than actually turning in faster, which is what you want. But then again, it was one of those things we needed to do. As you can see, there's not a massive change in the stats on the handling, even when we move down to the stock, but for this build it seemed to work pretty well, but just be wary. Over to the drivetrain. So for this car we put it at street transmission. Race transmission or sport transmission was just too much PI, we didn't need it. The street transmission is fine as it is. Driveline, have put the race driveline on. This is one of the things you'd always consider near the end of building a car. It's definitely not a high priority. It usually comes down to the tyres, the aero, and then the engine parts first. Driveline is one of those last things if you've got a bit of PI spare and you just want to shave a few pounds from the car. And then the differential though, this is something that's key. It doesn't matter whether you've got an all-wheel drive car, rear-wheel drive car, front-wheel drive car, two-wheel drive car, anything. Basically you need the differential, because this is key when it comes to fine-tuning a car on the racetrack. So always make sure that you have this. I've noticed a lot of people make the error of forgetting to put this in whilst they're buying a car, building it up for the first time, and then they have this schoolboy error that they realise that they're losing a lot of potential around corners just because they're not playing around with the differential. Okay, moving over to the platform and the handling. So for this build we have gone with the race brakes. As I mentioned, sometimes you don't always need to have race brakes on all-wheel drive, because typically the brakes are pretty decent anyway, but I think if you really want to fine-tune, then by all means do the race brakes, because the actual bias that you put between braking, be it more on the front tyres or the rear tyres, that will play a lot in how your car actually turns around corners. So we've gone with race. We have the race spring and dampers. Roll cage we've kept to stock, don't particularly need it. On some cars it's just not that beneficial to have it. Obviously you'd sacrifice weight if you go with the race chassis. Obviously it says you get a bit more handling and braking, but then again we lose a bit of the acceleration, so always bear that in mind. And then for the weight reduction, we have gone for race weight reduction. I would say always go for this on an all-wheel drive car. Just always make the car as light as humanly possible, because what you want to capitalize on is the amount of acceleration you get at low speeds. And you need the car to be lighter so that you have a much faster start time off the line, that you can get up to maximum speed or get to the first turn before anyone else, because when you're in a race, the all-wheel drive cars will typically struggle a lot on the straights compared to other cars. So you need to make sure that you just have that high acceleration and that you can pull out of corners really quickly by keeping it light. Over to the engine. I don't think there's tons of pots that we've put on, but we have a race intake. We have the sport fuel system. We did have race ignition, but then I ended up ditching it. It wasn't really needed. So we have stock ignition here. We have the race exhaust. We have the race camshaft and valves. We have stock valves, sport engine block, race pistons compression, single turbo. We kept it as stock, we did not put in that turbo, but by all means you can try and make it a bit more power orientated if you want, but with that 21 PI it adds on, you'd really have to sacrifice the handling. And as I mentioned before, you really need to prioritize handling with all-wheel drive cars, especially in S-Class. Once they get below 6.0 handling, the benefits of the car really get outweighed, to be honest. There's very few people that can pull it off having such low handling in an all-wheel drive car, so we've kept it as the stock turbo. Intercooler we did not use because it will typically make the car a bit heavier. As you can see, it adds on the most of 20 pounds. Oil and cooling we kept as stock. We did try it, but it adds on weight as well, and it's just not worth it for that extra 5 horsepower it gives you. And the flywheel we left as stock. Along with the drivetrain, the flywheel really is near the bottom of the list in terms of things you want to work on, but you know, it's one of those things, so just bear it in mind. If you've always got one bit of PI spare, you can always go for that. Now that we've walked through the build, I hope this part has helped you. Let's now look at the tune that I actually used for the Ford RS200, both in the division of Rally Heroes along with S-Class in general. So we have tyre pressure at 2828. The gearing, we cannot change it because we've got that street transmission. To be honest, the gears actually work really well on this car, and on some cars, especially the Nissan Skylines, like the GTRs, the 2002, and then the older versions of the Godzillas, sometimes the stock or street transmission is actually good enough. So I'd say give them a go first. If you find that on certain tracks you really want to be faster at, that the gears just aren't optimized, so maybe tracks that have got longer straights, a bit like on Nürburgring GP, between the last turn to the first turn, it's quite a long straight, so you might want to have the gears different there, but here we've kept it as stock. The alignment we have as the camber being -1.7 on the front and then -2.0 on the rear. So typically with rear wheel drive cars, you'd have it the other way around. You'd actually have the rear camber a lot closer to 0. And the reason is because where all the power is purely going through the rear tyres, you need as much contact on the road as possible with them rear tyres. You need every inch of the tyre available to deliver that horsepower onto the road. When it comes to all-wheel drive as well as front-wheel drive, it becomes a little bit different actually, because what you need to induce is a lot of oversteer in the car, and sometimes raising the rear camber can help this by making them more slanted, so that when you are turning, the back of the car is going to swing around just a little bit further, and you need that because all-wheel drive cars by nature are a bit understeery, a lot like front-wheel drive cars. So that's why we have that. The tow we've kept as 0 and 0. You can experiment with this of course, but for this build it seems to work really fine. If you were to change it, all you'd do is actually just make the tow positive on either end, but to be honest, you might get into a situation where the car is a bit too twitchy for your liking, so beware about that. And then for the front cluster, I've put it as 6. So the reason why I didn't keep it as 5 was that sometimes going through making transitions from left to right, the car would actually get too snappy. So that's why we've moved it higher up, so that the steering feels a little bit smoother at the higher speeds when going through chicanes, as well as S-bends like you have at Kota West. Anti-roll bars, as you can see, we've really pushed on an emphasis for oversteer, and you're going to see a similar thing with the springs as well. So front anti-roll bars are 5.18 on the front, the rear is 30.09. I basically just wanted to get that closest to 30 as possible, but all in all it's just about, we want the car to have a lot of initial rotation into bends, because when you get about the halfway point of any turn in an all-wheel drive car, you basically want the car already set up to shoot out in a straight line. That's effectively how you want to drive them. You don't want to be taking a smooth curve the same way with rear wheel drive cars, because with all wheel drive cars you've got power going in the front tyres as well. So that means the car is not always going to be driving in the direction you're facing it. You often get quite a fair bit of sideways action. So you want to encourage a bit of slidiness actually, because the car tyres are going to naturally scrub against the floor. So be willing to brake harsh, turn very early, and then just shoot out as fast as you can out of turns. With the springs, what we've done is try to induce some oversteer as well and force more of the weight towards the front, so that when we are initially braking and turning into a corner, a lot of the rotation can be made early. So that's why we have 359.8 on the front spring, the rear is 463.3. You could obviously change just how soft or stiff the springs are. For me, I found that this is a good balance so that the car can manage going over quite a few curbs. You can always risk it by making the strings in general a lot stiffer, but I'd say keep a difference to the most of 100 between the front and the rear. As for the ride height, we've just raised the rear ever so slightly, as I mentioned, just to put a bit more weight to the front whenever we're turning, because otherwise that sensation of understeer will be incredibly strong, and it's something that you don't want to have when you're trying to drive fast. Onto the damping, the rebound stiffness we have is 6.9 on the front, 7 on the rear, then 3.0 for front bump stiffness, and then 3.1 for rear bump stiffness. Honestly, with this car, for some reason I was just struggling with trying all sorts of different numbers. I ended up just settling on these, so forgive me for not having a scientific explanation, but the truth is I've even tried tuning calculators in the past and sometimes they are really hit and miss, so I just went by what I feel works best. Feel free to try this and let me know how it goes. Onto the downforce. As I mentioned, we wanted to have that aero because we want to create a lot of downforce, help create a lot of oversteer whilst also keeping the car planted. So we have just gone for maximum downforce, 100 pounds on the front and then 316 on the rear. If you wanted that tail end of the car to really swing out even further, then all you need to do is remove some of that aero. But for me, with the way that I built this car to make sure that it could fit in the divisions as well, the maximum aero proved the most useful. Then braking, we have 49% on the balance. Reason for this being is, even though you want to try and keep a lot of weight on the front tyres, I personally like to trail brake quite a lot, so that's why we've just put a bit of emphasis on the rear tyres when initially braking. That will just help you steer a little bit as you first brake, and then eventually the car will just start understeering anyway. So I have it as that, and then brake pressure is completely your preference. I would say keep it anywhere between 120% to maybe 160, but for me I settled with 150. Now onto the differential. This is, I think, one of the hardest parts that people have with tuning all-wheel drive cars. So let me walk you through it. Basically, when you have this front differential, just remember you've got power that actually goes to the front tyres, and what you want to minimize is the wheels locking up and just spinning unnecessarily, because then you're going to create a lot of understeer on corner entry and then halfway around a turn and then on corner exit, and what you'll find is the car just plows along in a straight line, not going in the direction that you want it to. So that's why we've brought the differential all the way down to 20%, just so that each tyre can actually spin a lot independently. We haven't took it all the way down to 0 because if you take it too far low, then what you'll find is a lot of power will sometimes go to the wrong tyre and it will kind of be useless, especially if there's one tyre up in the air. All of the power will just go to that tyre that's in the air and none of it is being planted into the floor. So we've left it as 20 there. Deceleration we've left as 0 because we really do not want the tyres locking up whatsoever whilst we are braking. As I mentioned, all-wheel drive cars can feel very understeery, so we want to make sure that the car can actually oversteer when we brake but without losing control. So we kept that as 0. Then when it comes to the rear tyres, we've kept it mostly for the tyres to lock, because the rear wheels, we want the opposite effect compared to the front. The front wheels, we don't want them to lock up at all. The rears, we kind of do, because with them locking and then spinning at the same rate, that can actually help induce some oversteer whilst we're exiting, and to be honest, you just need that in the cars. Whereas for the deceleration, we've kept that as 0, the exact same reasoning for the front wheels. We just want as much spin whilst we're braking, just to help us when we are turning, whether that's just braking in a straight line and then trying to turn, or you're trail braking, so you're trying to turn and brake at the same time. You have that option because the tyres are moving at different rates. And then onto the centre, I think this is something people really think too much about. Basically, the more of the balance you have to the rear, the more the car will drive like a rear wheel drive car. The more you have the balance to the front, the more it will drive like a front wheel drive car. So just imagine, the more you have it to the front, naturally the more understeer the car will feel. Whereas the more you have it to the rear, the more oversteer the car will naturally get. So usually the range for all-wheel drive cars will be between 70 to 60%. I think that's a very good rule of thumb. You don't want to play around much more than that. We ended up just going bang in the middle, which is at 65% here, and it just seemed like a really good balance because we're able to get that oversteer when we want it, and the car might feel like it's about to lose control, but then the front tyres start to kick in with power, and then it all kind of holds together pretty well. So there we go, that is the tune itself. I hope it helps you guys a lot. I'm hoping that the explanations I've given will be very useful for you guys going forward when it comes to tuning any cars. I think this tune setup will actually be good for any type of car that you make all-wheel drive, so consider it like a base setting if you want. Just try it on cars and let me know in the comments what you think of it below. If you've enjoyed this video, please make sure you are subscribed and you've hit that bell icon so you could be notified on future videos. And on top of that, if you are not already involved, get in on the live streams that I hold on every Wednesday. It'll be Wednesday evenings at 8 PM British summertime. We do open lobbies, myself and LZR Rossi. We go through different classes like B class, A class, S class, and sometimes we're going to venture out to do other things as well. So we get a great mixture of racers from different skill levels. We've got some people that are top 10 in the world, other people top 50, other people are just casual gamers who want to have a chance of racing against faster people. So if you're interested, please do join us on Wednesdays, or just send me a message that you want an invitation when the time comes. But other than that, I hope you've enjoyed this video, guys. Please check out the other videos on my channel, and I shall see you soon in the next video. Bye bye.